Hey guys, tonight we walk the quiet boards of Atlantic City. Moonlight glinting off damp planks, the ocean muttering secrets just beyond the rail. A man in a beige windbreaker moves slowly, deliberately, as though each step carries weight, not just in muscle, but in memory. His hands are buried deep in his coat pockets, not for warmth, but for certainty. Nicodemo Scarfo doesn't like surprises. He scans every shadow, every reflection in casino glass, every nod that lasts too long. The lights of the Tropicana blink in rhythm, like some coded warning only he can read. This is not a man who trusts easily or sleeps deeply, and you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in his shoes. Too much pressure, too many ghosts, too many lies that needed to be remembered perfectly. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo is walking a tightrope stretched between legacy and paranoia. Born March 8, 1929, in Brooklyn, he's the son of a humble shoemaker who packed up the family and moved to South Philadelphia when Nicky was still in grade school. The neighborhood they moved into pulsed with immigrant life. Boys playing stickball on cracked asphalt, women arguing across fire escapes, and corner stores run by men who knew more about numbers than groceries. The young Scarfo never really fit the part of a feared man. He was tiny, frail even. Teachers remembered him as moody and easily insulted. One wrong glance and his face would tighten, like a match waiting for a spark. Most boys his age learned to let things go. Nicky learned to file things away, quietly, patiently, and permanently. In schoolyards and sandlots, respect wasn't handed to you. You either earned it with charm, size, or force. And Scarfo wasn't charming, and he sure wasn't big, but he had a sharp tongue, quick fists, and that dangerous little glint behind his eyes that said he might go further than anyone else was willing to. He started small. Pranks that turned mean, dares that turned violent. But even in those early days, the message was clear. Underestimate him at your own risk. By his late teens, he drifted toward boxing. Not because he had dreams of titles, but because it gave him license to hit without apology. He boxed amateur in Philadelphia's South Side, collecting bruises and grudges in equal measure. But in the ring, as in life, Scarfo was better with strategy than strength. He rarely won outright, but he always left a mark people began to notice. The wrong people, or maybe the right ones, depending on your view of morality. Among them were low-level associates of the Philadelphia crime family, men who saw in Scarfo not just ambition, but a willingness to prove it with violence. One night in the early 1950s, Scarfo found himself in a bar altercation. What started as a shouting match turned into a stabbing. A man ended up dead, and Scarfo was arrested for manslaughter. But here's the thing. He didn't shy away from it. He didn't run. In fact, many say he strutted into the courtroom, looking like a man proud of his own rage. He did a short stint, but the impact rippled far beyond that jail cell. For men like him, violence wasn't a liability. It was a resume. This was a time when the mafia's code rewarded loyalty, silence, and retribution. Scarfo embodied all three. Many people still think that if it weren't for that stabbing, he might have remained just another forgotten scrapper from the docks. So what do you think? Was that moment a mistake? or Scarfo's audition for something darker. By the mid-1950s, he had slipped quietly into the orbit of the Bruno crime family. Angelo Bruno, the so-called Gentle Don, ran the family with an iron glove wrapped in velvet. Bruno believed in low-profile leadership. He wanted peace with profit. Scarfo, not so much. But he knew better than to challenge power too early. Instead, he shadowed Bruno's men, made himself useful, and built up a quiet reputation for getting things done, especially when done meant someone didn't get back up afterward. He also started building his personal code. Never talk out of turn, never let a slight go unanswered, and never trust a man who smiles too easily. And yes, Scarfo smiled, but only when he meant it, only when the math made sense, only when it hurt. By the end of the decade, Scarfo was no longer the shoemaker's son. He was something harder, something sharper, a man with a plan and a memory like wet cement. Everything stuck, but Philadelphia wasn't his final playground. Not yet. For now, his shadow still crept behind others, still learning, still waiting, still watching every reflection in every window, because to Nicodemo Scarfo, nothing was more dangerous than the face you didn't see coming. The streets of South Philadelphia might have shaped him, but Nicodemo Scarfo's destiny was decided by the slice of Atlantic City nobody wanted. His rise was not through charm, nor charisma, nor clever conversation. It was carved instead by proximity to violence and a brutal talent for knowing when to use it. And if the young Nicky was unpredictable in schoolyards and corner fights, that same trait made him irresistible to the underworld men who trafficked in fear like currency. Scarfo's early jobs weren't glamorous. He wasn't shaking hands with dons or running high-stakes rackets. He was driving trucks, delivering numbers, collecting envelopes, grunt work mostly. But he did it with a meticulousness that caught attention. He memorized addresses, routines, grudges. One bookmaker said, "That kid remembered who owed $10.54, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to." He became known for having the memory of a ledger and the heart of a lockbox. He never tattled, never wavered. If you gave him an order, it got done. And if you crossed him, well, even minor offenses got stored in that mental vault, sealed with bitterness and dusted off when the time was right. One such moment came in 1963. A Union delegate supposedly laughed a little too long at one of Scarfo's jokes. The man was found the next morning with a busted jaw and no memory of how he'd gotten there. No witnesses, no arrests. But everyone in the neighborhood walked a little straighter around Nicky after that. Still, not everyone admired his methods. Angelo Bruno, who valued peace and discretion, often viewed Scarfo as a problem in waiting. He once reportedly said, "He's a dog with a chain, but the chain ain't bolted." Bruno's words weren't empty. In fact, in the late 60s, he made a calculated move. Rather than promote Scarfo within the Philadelphia hierarchy, he reassigned him, effectively banished him to Atlantic City. At the time, Atlantic City wasn't the glitzy escape we think of now. It was crumbling. Casinos were still illegal. The boardwalk creaked with the weight of nostalgia, not money. To many wise guys, getting sent there was like being told to count pigeons. But to Scarfo, it was a blank canvas, and a punishment he would turn into power. He arrived with little more than a short temper, a few loyal friends, and a chip on his shoulder, the size of a brick. He immediately started frequenting small bars, diners, and union halls, listening more than talking, watching how the trash got picked up, who paved the sidewalks, which inspectors showed up late. He wasn't interested in glitz. He wanted systems, especially the ones already rotting from the inside. And then, fate threw him a lifeline. In 1976, New Jersey legalized casino gambling. Atlantic City, almost overnight, became a gold rush town. Construction boomed, unions ballooned, and every delivery truck now smelled of wet concrete and opportunity. Scarfo was already there, already planted, already watching. He began slowly, offering help to local construction bosses. A few contracts here, a few hands greased there. It didn't take much. A city trying to reinvent itself has little time to vet the men behind the curtain. Scarfo found his niche in the middle. Not too loud, not too hidden. He became the silent partner to a dozen local businesses, all of them suddenly doing quite well. And just as importantly, he started rebuilding his crew. Small at first, hand-picked. Not for muscle, but for loyalty. He didn't want thinkers. He wanted believers. Men who'd take a bullet without blinking, or better yet, fire one without asking why. Many people still think that Scarfo's real genius wasn't violence, but vision. He understood that power didn't come from pulling triggers, but from holding contracts, organizing labor strikes, and making mayors shake your hand even when they smelled the gasoline on your jacket. So, what do you think? Was Scarfo ahead of his time, or just lucky enough to land where greed outpaced caution? One of his first serious moves involved the bartender at a small lounge who'd been slow to pay protection. Scarfo didn't yell, didn't threaten. He just sat quietly at the end of the bar for 3 nights in a row, drinking ginger ale, smiling politely. On the 4th night, the bartender handed him a thick envelope with trembling hands. No words were exchanged, just a nod. That was the moment Atlantic City began to understand who was really in charge. And Scarfo? He liked that kind of quiet recognition. Not applause, respect. He even started dressing the part. Gone were the dusty work clothes. In came the pastel shirts, open collars, and the occasional gold chain. Not flashy, just enough to say, I'm not one of you anymore. His height, or lack thereof, stopped mattering. He wasn't the short kid anymore. He was the man whose name made construction foremen stutter. The guy the local precinct captain waved to without making eye contact. Still, that familiar itch of paranoia never left him. He sat with his back to walls, never answered his own phone, and always parked facing the exit. At times, it seemed almost ritualistic, like superstition wrapped in steel, one associate later recalled. Nicky would switch seats at a diner if the light hit him wrong. Said he didn't want reflections in his coffee. Even as the money rolled in, Scarfo remained haunted. He knew how quickly fortunes changed. He'd seen made men drop like flies, families vanish in the blink of a double cross. Power, to Scarfo, wasn't a crown. It was a countdown. And so he kept counting. Money, enemies, favors owed, and smiles that lasted too long. He was becoming something new. Not just a player in the game, but a man quietly rewriting the rules behind velvet curtains and construction dust. The story of Nicodemo Scarfo would not be complete without the blade, the literal one he carried, and the metaphorical one he held to the throat of Atlantic City. In the underworld, reputations are often whispered long before they're written. And Scarfo's reputation, even in the early days of his Atlantic City exile, began to pulse with sharp edges. It wasn't long after his quiet establishment in town that someone made the wrong kind of mistake. A low-level associate, someone Scarfo had allowed into his growing circle, got into a drunken argument at a social club. The man, full of cheap whiskey and louder than usual, let a few words slip. The kind of words that carried names and hinted at rackets. By morning, the gossip had reached Scarfo's ears. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't send a message. He showed up himself. The man was found dead the next night behind a laundromat, face down in a puddle of rain and regret. No police statements, no charges, just silence. And a lesson everyone took to heart. Scarfo, they learned, didn't delegate lessons in loyalty. That moment solidified him in the eyes of both enemies and allies. He wasn't just dangerous. He was willing to act personally, and that made him 10 times more feared than a Don who outsourced his wrath. What made it all the more chilling was how small he looked in contrast to the brutality he unleashed. Barely 5'5", he didn't stride. He moved like a shadow. His voice was soft, nasal, almost dismissive. But when he spoke, it didn't matter if you understood what he was saying. You understood that you were being measured. One former associate, who later entered witness protection, described Scarfo as the kind of guy who'd offer you sugar for your coffee while planning your funeral. There was no bluster in him, just calculation, and that made him nearly impossible to predict. It's worth noting here how Scarfo's version of respect wasn't built on community favor or traditional codes. It was built on fear so granular that even friends never fully exhaled around him. He was, in every way, allergic to vulnerability. He began purchasing small properties, dingy parking lots, broken down storefronts, aging diners. These were strategic, not sentimental. Each had proximity to new casino projects, union offices, or upcoming city zoning discussions. He was building an invisible kingdom, one lease agreement at a time, and when negotiations failed, the blade came out. In one well-whispered case, a local developer refused to cooperate with Scarfo's offer to streamline the permit process. A week later, the man's car exploded. It was a clear message, but wrapped in plausible deniability. The fire marshal blamed it on faulty wiring. Scarfo? He just raised his eyebrows and said nothing. It became his signature reaction, part performance, part philosophy. He understood that fear has a shelf life if it's too loud. But if it's quiet, if it seeps into people's routines like humidity into wallpaper, then it sticks. Many people still think that Scarfo's genius was his timing. He didn't move too fast. He let the city breathe just enough to not realize it was being choked. So what do you think? Is that patience or something colder? Inside his private circle, Scarfo began elevating a few close loyalists, men like Phil Leonetti, his own nephew. Scarfo believed blood was thicker than ambition. He thought family would never flip. That belief would, in time, come back to haunt him. But for now, it gave him control over his inner sanctum. He also started grooming a small team of enforcers, men known not for their brains, but their silence. They were paid well, kept in line with a mixture of fear and admiration, and were known to appear when problems needed to be solved, without noise. Scarfo called them the quiet ones. And Atlantic City, it seemed, had no shortage of problems. By the late 1970s, Scarfo wasn't just tolerated, he was feared. The casinos had no choice but to nod in his direction. The unions bowed to his schedule. Even local politicians began using vague phrases like consultants and third-party mediators when discussing controversial deals. And still, Scarfo kept to his rituals. He walked the same boardwalk path most mornings, sat in the same booth at his favorite diner, ate the same veal cutlet with the same dry red wine. The waitress who served him said he never made small talk, never tipped in coins, and never, ever touched the knife on the table. He brought his own. One evening, he showed up at a small backroom poker game. A new guy, fresh muscle from Newark, started laughing too hard at a joke involving Scarfo's height. The room went quiet. Scarfo didn't flinch. He simply pulled a folded piece of newspaper from his jacket pocket, slid it across the table, and smiled. Inside, a clipping about a man found with his legs broken in 3 places. No words were exchanged. But the Newark guy never came back. That was Scarfo's method. Not threats, premonitions. And yet, for all the theatrics, there was a system. Scarfo had rules. He didn't condone random violence. Every move had a purpose, every punishment, a precedent. In his mind, that made him not just justified, but noble. A historian later described Scarfo as a man who considered himself an ethical executioner. The irony, of course, is that such men rarely last. But in 1980, Scarfo's future seemed infinite. Atlantic City was booming, money was rolling, his enemies were shrinking. And the little man with the big paranoia? He was just getting started. Nicodemo Scarfo didn't just learn violence. He studied it like a language. And his favorite tutor? The one and only Angelo Bruno. Though the two were temperamentally worlds apart, Scarfo served his apprenticeship under Bruno with the same dedication a monk might show to a sacred text. Angelo Bruno, the gentle Don, reigned over the Philadelphia crime family with unusual restraint. His strategy was simple: keep the peace, stay out of the newspapers, and let the money flow quietly. He avoided drug dealing, discouraged internal conflict, and punished recklessness. To Bruno, quiet leadership was smart leadership. Scarfo, though, was a different creature. He respected Bruno's power, but not his softness. Where Bruno saw opportunity and harmony, Scarfo saw it in fear. Still, Scarfo watched and learned. He sat at the edges of meetings, memorized names, understood who owed what to whom. He wasn't yet powerful enough to speak, but his ears were always open, and his fingers always twitching under the table. During the 1960s and early 70s, Scarfo operated in the background, handling collections, smoothing out union disputes, and every so often, removing a problem from circulation. He earned a reputation for being the guy who could settle a situation quickly. Not delicately, just quickly. One of Bruno's underbosses once described him as the emergency exit nobody wanted to use. You didn't go to Scarfo unless you were ready to light the match, and yet Bruno tolerated him. Why? Partly because Scarfo got results, but mostly because the Atlantic City outpost gave him just enough room to be useful without becoming disruptive. Bruno understood that some dogs are better kept in the yard, snarling where they can't bite your guests. Scarfo, however, was growing restless. He was tired of being seen as a useful tool. He wanted to be the hand that held the tool, the one calling the shots. Then came 1980. Angelo Bruno was assassinated, shot in the head while sitting in a car outside his home. No warning, no trial. Just a single blast, and the kind of silence that changes cities. The killing shattered the delicate balance Bruno had built. The Philadelphia crime family plunged into chaos. Factions emerged, alliances shifted, and blood began to spill at a pace not seen in decades. Scarfo didn't mourn. He saw opportunity. With Bruno gone, the door to power wasn't just ajar. It had been blown clean off its hinges. And Scarfo, who'd spent years licking his wounds and building quiet power in Atlantic City, was ready to step through. He began quietly reaching out to allies, calling in favors, testing loyalties. He was no fool. He knew stepping into Bruno's shoes wouldn't be smooth. But he also knew no one else had built what he had, a beachhead in a city on the rise, a crew of fiercely loyal men, and a reputation that made even hardened gangsters pause before speaking his name. And he used that fear wisely. He didn't storm into Philadelphia demanding power. He let others make mistakes first, let them tear each other apart, let the hotheads burn out. Meanwhile, Scarfo kept building. One historical fact worth noting. At this time, the FBI began shifting serious resources to the Philadelphia and Atlantic City regions. Bruno's death had triggered alarm bells. Suddenly, agents who once saw South Jersey as a side note were now tuning in with full attention. Wiretaps increased. Surveillance picked up. And Scarfo, he noticed. He adjusted. He began holding meetings in fishing boats, restaurants with too much ambient noise, or out on park benches in public spaces. He never stayed in one place for long. Even his own men didn't know his full schedule. He moved like a chess piece being played by a paranoid grandmaster, every square a possible trap, and the paranoia, it blossomed. Many people still think that Scarfo wasn't just strategic. He was scared, terrified even. So what do you think? Was his caution a strength, or the thing that eventually ate him from the inside out? Back in Atlantic City, Scarfo began building a more formal hierarchy. He promoted men with clean records, kept them at arm's length from the dirtiest jobs, and used buffers between himself and operations. He was creating an empire not just of fear, but of plausible deniability. One story from this era tells of Scarfo giving a new associate a handshake and a steak knife. The associate looked puzzled. Scarfo reportedly said, "In case your smile wears off before dessert." Was it a joke? Maybe. But everyone at the table laughed the same way you laugh when thunder cracks just a little too close. The message was always the same: don't get comfortable. Scarfo also began tinkering with the labor unions, especially those tied to construction and hotel services. He inserted his men into leadership roles, began collecting dues for safety, and ensured that no casino could build a deck without checking with him first. It wasn't about brute force anymore. It was about knowing where the permits lived, how long inspections took, and which contractors could be leaned on just enough to say yes without asking who else was saying no. He wasn't just climbing the ladder. He was replacing the rungs as he went, and slowly, surely, he became the undisputed boss of the Philadelphia family. The gentle Don was gone. Now came the era of little Nicky, shorter, meaner, and 10 times less forgiving. To the casual observer, Atlantic City in the early 1980s was booming. Neon lights flickered against dark ocean skies. Tourists spilled out of casinos with cigarette breath and hopeful pockets, and every valet stand glimmered with Cadillacs and ambition. But beneath that polished veneer, a different game played out. One where unions didn't strike without approval, where building permits traveled in pairs, one legal, one whispered, and where one man's name passed lips only when the room had been swept for bugs. Nicodemo Scarfo wasn't just back in power, he was the power. With the death of Angelo Bruno, and after a brief period of bloody infighting within the Philadelphia mob, Scarfo emerged as the family's boss. Short in stature, explosive in temper, and wholly unafraid to use force as punctuation. And though he ruled from Atlantic City, the reach of his paranoia stretched up the Jersey Turnpike like a cold front. His coronation came not with celebration, but calculation. He gathered his most trusted men, Phil Leonetti, Lawrence Yogi Merlino, Frank Monte, and a handful of others, and declared more or less that the rules had changed. The old days of quiet harmony were over. From now on, fear would be enforced, not implied. And it started with blood. Within his first year as boss, Scarfo approved, or personally ordered, more than a dozen hits. Men who questioned him, disrespected him, or even hesitated too long before answering were taken for a ride. The murders weren't subtle. Bodies turned up in parking lots, alleyways, and trunks. And the message was loud. Scarfo didn't tolerate indecision. One story that rippled through the ranks involved a made guy named Vincent Falcone. Once a close associate, Falcone had started running his mouth. Small-time complaints about money, Scarfo's leadership style, who was really calling the shots. Word got back. Scarfo invited him to a house on North Georgia Avenue under the pretense of smoothing things over. Phil Leonetti was there, so was a bottle of champagne. They toasted. Then Scarfo pulled a gun and shot Falcone in the head. Leonetti later recalled Scarfo standing over the body, furious not at the betrayal, but at the mess on the carpet. This was Scarfo's Philadelphia, a place where a smile could mean anything, and the back door was never just for deliveries, even among other mob families. His reign was considered extreme. In New York, bosses preferred subtlety. Chicago played the long game. But Scarfo? He brought a kind of reckless intensity that made even his allies flinch. If you had dinner with him and cracked the wrong joke, you might not see dessert. He was the kind of man who expected loyalty without question and obedience without hesitation. Yet, in this cruelty, he found control. People feared Scarfo not because he was violent, but because he was unpredictable. His mood swung on dimes. He could be joking one moment, then quietly whispering about cleaning house the next. His eyes would narrow, and his men knew. No one was safe, not even family. And that family, both literal and criminal, obeyed. He appointed his nephew Phil Leonetti as underboss, a controversial move. Many in the organization resented the nepotism, but Scarfo didn't care. He trusted Leonetti, or perhaps more accurately, he believed he could control him. The irony? Leonetti would eventually be the man to betray him, but at this point, they were still thick as thieves, if not thicker. Many people still think that Scarfo's downfall began the day he trusted blood over business. So what do you think? Does loyalty lie in lineage or actions? Back in Atlantic City, Scarfo continued expanding his grip on unions, casinos, and the construction world. He was making money hand over fist, skimming from contractors, taking kickbacks, offering security services for high-stakes tables. Everything had a price, and Scarfo made sure he got his cut first. A historical fact worth noting. Under Scarfo's control, the Philadelphia family earned tens of millions annually from Atlantic City rackets alone. The FBI called it the most lucrative real estate for organized crime on the East Coast at the time. Yet, with money came paranoia. Scarfo began suspecting his own men of plotting against him. He installed listening devices in his own offices, changed meeting spots weekly, switched cars randomly. Even in his favorite restaurants, he would only sit facing the entrance and never touched a drink unless it came sealed. A waiter once reported that Scarfo sent back a glass of wine because the cork looked tired. But that wasn't wine paranoia. That was life paranoia. Scarfo lived like every shadow held a blade, and perhaps it did. By now, the FBI was watching him closely. Wiretaps were recording his voice. Informants were being flipped. Agents were drawing diagrams with his name at the center. Red yarn connecting his face to casinos, banks, politicians, and bodies. Still, Scarfo moved forward. He didn't slow down. He didn't soften. He doubled down, and in doing so, became not just a mob boss, but a case study in what happens when power, fear, and unchecked ego form a triangle sharp enough to draw blood. The ocean breeze that once brought salt and renewal to Atlantic City now seemed to carry whispers. Whispers of bodies gone missing, of partners suddenly silent, of business deals inked in nerves and obligation. And at the center of it all stood Nicodemo Scarfo, short, sharp, and increasingly impossible to predict. Scarfo didn't run his empire like a typical mob boss. There were no grand social clubs with open-door policies, no fatherly chats over espresso. His headquarters wasn't some storied corner hangout. It was wherever he felt safest that week. Sometimes a suite in a casino, sometimes a family-owned pizzeria with too many cameras, sometimes just his car, idling under a street lamp while bodyguards stood a few feet away, too afraid to blink. He had become a master of compartmentalization. No one in his crew knew everything. Not even Leonetti, his underboss. Each man had a slice of truth, a sliver of the full picture. Scarfo controlled the puzzle and made sure no one had more than 4 pieces. This tactic came in handy when things got messy, which they often did. Take the case of Frank Monte, one of Scarfo's most trusted captains. For years, Monte was a loyal soldier, helped with collections, enforced decisions, smoothed out business conflicts. But then, a rumor. Monte might be talking too much, asking too many questions, playing both sides. Scarfo didn't investigate. He didn't confront. He didn't offer a warning. He simply ordered the hit. Monte was gunned down in broad daylight, shot multiple times outside his home. No ceremony, no second chances. The killing sent shockwaves through the organization. If Scarfo would eliminate someone that close, that quickly, then what chance did the rest have? But that was the message. There were no degrees of separation. Everyone was replaceable. Scarfo's paranoia wasn't just private, it was policy. Associates began second-guessing themselves. Conversations got shorter. Loyalty became performative, with men outdoing one another just to prove they were still in. A strange kind of fear-based arms race unfolded. Some crew members kept detailed journals of their tasks, proof that they were following orders. Others bought him gifts, rare cigars, antique knives, Italian leather shoes, anything to remind the boss that they were useful. Harmless. Scarfo, for his part, watched all of it with narrowed eyes. He liked the power. He liked the control. But he didn't trust it. One detail that captures this perfectly. Scarfo installed a security system in his Atlantic City home so sensitive it would alert him if a window shifted more than an inch. Not opened, just shifted. He'd often tested himself in the middle of the night, pacing barefoot in the hallway with a Beretta tucked into his waistband, and that weapon wasn't for decoration. He carried it constantly, even within the walls of his own home. He believed a man could never be too prepared. He once said, "The one time you don't carry is the one time you don't get to carry again." Meanwhile, the business kept growing. Scarfo's influence extended beyond casinos and into the construction world. He controlled who poured the concrete, who installed the pipes, and who made sure none of it collapsed. If you wanted a contract in Atlantic City, you didn't go through City Hall. You went through Scarfo, and you paid for the privilege. Sometimes the payments were direct. Other times they were hidden. Extra line items on invoices, no-show jobs for mob relatives, security consultations that involved nothing but a phone call and a nod. Scarfo didn't need to swing a hammer. He just needed your payroll, a mainstream historical fact. During this period, Scarfo's crew controlled large portions of the Laborers International Union of North America, LIUNA. Through union influence, he controlled labor costs, picket lines, and project timelines. It was the perfect racket. Legitimate on the surface, lethal beneath it. Many people still think that Scarfo's greatest power came not from guns or fear, but from his ability to make the legal world bend around him. So what do you think? Is true power the ability to kill, or the ability to avoid needing to? As his empire solidified, Scarfo began indulging just a little. He never went full flash like some mobsters, but the signs were there. His suits got sharper, his watch a little more gold than before. He bought a condo with an ocean view, though the curtains stayed closed. He enjoyed good wine, even if he rarely finished the glass. And yet, he never truly relaxed. One night, at a private dinner with top lieutenants, a waiter accidentally dropped a spoon. The clatter echoed like a gunshot. Scarfo didn't flinch, but the room did. Everyone turned to watch his face. He simply said, "Somebody tell him not to do that again." The waiter never came back. That's how it was under Scarfo. The rules were unwritten, but enforced. You learned quickly, or you disappeared quietly. It created a world where silence wasn't just golden. It was survival. By the early 1980s, Nicodemo Scarfo had become something rare in American organized crime. A boss who didn't just inspire fear, he curated it. His entire persona, from the steel-tight gait to the clipped way he greeted you with your own name and a pause, was engineered to keep people guessing. And guessing, as it turns out, was exhausting. But it worked. Scarfo didn't want friends. He wanted eyes that darted away when his gaze met yours. He wanted dinner guests who sat straight, who never brought dates, who didn't ask who else might be coming. There was a kind of psychological erosion he cultivated in his inner circle. They didn't just follow him. They adjusted to him. And the more Atlantic City thrived, the more Scarfo calcified into this terrifying form. At the center of his empire stood his small crew. Men with names like Leonetti, Merlino, Del Giorno. Some were bound by blood, others by blood spilled. But all of them knew that proximity to Scarfo meant power and danger. Like orbiting a star that might go nova on a Tuesday. A story circulated, one of those strange half-truths that everyone repeats because it feels too real to ignore. Scarfo had taken offense to a maid guy who smirked during a sit-down. Not laughed, not cracked wise, just smirked. The man was found the next day with a crushed larynx and no sign of forced entry. The official report said natural causes. Scarfo didn't confirm. He didn't deny. He just lit a cigarette and said, "Respect's a muscle. You let it go soft, and it won't hold up your mouth." Whether or not the story was true didn't matter. People acted like it was, and that's what made Scarfo's myth so effective. Yet for all his darkness, he was not reckless. Scarfo knew his limits. He understood that too many dead men drew too many eyes. So when violence wasn't the answer, he turned to manipulation. He became skilled at coercion that felt like courtesy. A city councilman would get a box of cigars with a note that read, "For your father, my condolences." The councilman's father hadn't died yet, but the point had been made, and he paid attention. Deeply, almost obsessively. Scarfo kept notebooks, not of crimes but of habits. Who went where? Who sat with whom? Who always arrived 5 minutes late? It wasn't about intelligence. It was about patterns. And if your pattern changed, Scarfo noticed. Many people still think that Scarfo would have made a brilliant intelligence officer. So what do you think? Is control through observation more dangerous than control through force? And speaking of force, let's talk about Chucky Merlino. Merlino was a longtime associate, later promoted to underboss. He was brash, loud, fond of bars and attention. Everything Scarfo wasn't. But Scarfo saw value in him, at least for a time. He used Merlino as a bludgeon, a visible symbol of the family's power and reach. But their relationship frayed quickly. Scarfo liked quiet operators. Merlino was a spotlight hog. After several public incidents, including a barroom brawl that ended in shots fired, Scarfo began distancing himself. He didn't confront Merlino directly. That wasn't his style. Instead, he gave him fewer assignments, moved him out of key meetings, assigned shadow watchers to track his movements. Eventually, Merlino's own paranoia caught up with him. He started drinking heavier, talking looser. Scarfo watched, quietly disappointed, as a once loyal soldier unraveled under the same scrutiny he himself thrived within. Another historical marker here. By this point, the FBI had launched a multi-year wiretap campaign targeting Scarfo's crew. They had bugs in bars, restaurants, apartments. Conversations about unions, hits, and property deals were being recorded daily. Agents grew obsessed with his cadence. Slow, deliberate, occasionally poetic in the way he hinted at murder. And yet, Scarfo continued as if untouched. He used coded language so subtle, even his own men weren't always sure what he meant. A hit wasn't a hit. It was a lunch with salt. A problem wasn't a problem. It was a dog that needs walking. Somehow, everyone understood anyway. Scarfo's world had become a theater. Each man an actor. Each act a test. Those who missed their cues didn't get another scene. Take the case of Salvi Testa. Testa was a rising star in the organization. Young, smart, ambitious. Too ambitious. Scarfo liked him at first, even admired his discipline. But when whispers began that Testa might be building his own loyal following, Scarfo didn't hesitate. He invited Testa to meet. They shook hands. Hours later, Testa's body was found riddled with bullets in a parking lot. Scarfo didn't offer an explanation, didn't apologize to the family. He simply removed a piece from the board and kept playing. Even within his closest ranks, the lesson was clear. Scarfo didn't just punish betrayal. He punished the possibility of betrayal. And yet, somehow, the machine kept running. Atlantic City kept growing. The unions kept paying. The casinos kept humming. Scarfo, the tiny tyrant with the careful walk and the colder stare, had created an empire built not on marble or gold, but on silence. They called it Little Nicky's Inner Circle. But for the men closest to Scarfo, it felt less like a privilege and more like a prolonged audition, with no script and no guarantee of a second act. To sit at his table was to sit with your back straight, your answers precise, your laughter cautious. Every meal could be a celebration or a setup, and no one ever knew which. Scarfo's paranoia didn't come in waves. It was constant. If you thought he was relaxing, it only meant he'd already made a decision about you. His suspicion wasn't dramatic. It was surgical, clean, cold, and terribly quiet. He began rotating where he stayed every few nights. Sometimes it was his Margate City townhouse. Other times, a casino suite under someone else's name. He'd have different people check in for him, different routes to his car, different times to take his morning walk. One former driver, who later cooperated with federal investigators, said, "He changed routines more often than he changed clothes. He'd have us drive the long way, just to see if anyone was following. If a car turned twice with us, we didn't just keep driving. We pulled into a gas station and waited, sometimes for an hour. He'd say, 'If they're thirsty, they'll drink.'" And this hypervigilance wasn't just limited to the streets. Inside his organization, Scarfo implemented his own version of counterintelligence. He had men watching men, lieutenants reporting on captains. Even his closest allies were shadowed, not out of distrust, but as a matter of protocol. He once said, "Loyalty that can't be verified isn't loyalty, it's hope. And hope's for gamblers." The irony? He was surrounded by gamblers. It was Atlantic City, after all. Still, Scarfo's grip only tightened. His word was law. His glance was gospel. And when someone stepped out of line, whether through arrogance, greed, or simple human error, the punishment was swift. Enter Raymond Long John Martirano, a high-ranking member of the Philadelphia family, and someone who'd once been considered untouchable. Martirano had connections, respect, and history, but Scarfo began to suspect he was operating too independently. Whispers came in. Martirano was expanding rackets without Scarfo's blessing, maybe even talking to out-of-town families. Scarfo didn't wait for confirmation. He greenlit the hit. Martirano was shot dead in 1984, his car riddled with bullets on a South Philly street. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. It was a thunderclap, meant to shake loose anyone clinging to the idea of autonomy. Many people still think that Scarfo began destroying his own organization from within the moment he started targeting his strongest players. So what do you think? Is leadership built on fear always doomed to cannibalize itself? Meanwhile, the money kept flowing. Scarfo's cut came from nearly every direction. Union kickbacks, loan sharking, gambling, construction, and casino skimming. The FBI estimated that by 1984, Scarfo's organization was pulling in over $30 million a year. And Scarfo took his slice with precision. He had his own bookkeeper, a quiet, gray-suited man named Anthony, who kept ledgers encoded in phrases like, "Dry weather favors the painter." And yes, the FBI eventually decoded them. But not before Scarfo had already spent a decade turning that money into silence, loyalty, and real estate. One mainstream historical fact: the Scarfo regime marked one of the bloodiest periods in Philadelphia Mafia history. Between 1980 and 1989, over 30 mob-connected murders were linked to Scarfo's orders or his internal disputes. That's more than the entire Bruno era combined. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, Scarfo maintained a certain decorum, an odd, chilling civility. He never shouted in public. He never threw tantrums like other bosses. When angry, he'd become quieter, slower. His voice would drop an octave, and his sentences would get shorter. That was the real warning. Phil Leonetti once described it like this: you didn't need to hear a threat. You just needed to see the space between his words. But not everyone feared him forever. In private, some began to question his leadership. Younger associates saw the murders as excessive. Older members worried the FBI was circling closer with every fresh body. And Scarfo? He suspected them all. One night, in a meeting at a supposedly clean house, he asked 3 top lieutenants a simple question. "If I were to die tonight, who do you think takes over?" The room went silent. He repeated the question. When one brave soul finally answered, "You'd never let that happen." Scarfo smiled. "That's the only right answer," he said, but he never called that man to another meeting again. Even his small personal pleasures were strange and watchful. Scarfo liked walks near the beach, but only at dusk. He enjoyed Sinatra, but only played cassettes, never the radio. And he loved a particular red sauce from a diner on Ventnor Avenue. So much so, he had it taste tested by 3 people before trying it himself. One time, when asked why he didn't trust food from his own kitchen, he replied, "Even salt looks like sugar, and that's how guys die smiling." Still, Scarfo believed he was untouchable. The fear he sowed insulated him, or so he thought, because while he kept watching the streets, the feds were listening from the ceiling. The downfall of Nicodemo Scarfo didn't come from a bullet. a betrayal in the back alley, or a rival family crossing state lines. No, it came from above, literally. Wires in ceilings, bugs in lamps, recorders tucked into cigarette packs and buttonholes. While Scarfo was scanning for taillights in his rearview mirror, the FBI was already in his living room, quietly, patiently, recording every whispered threat, every coded command, every sentence that ended in a nod instead of a verb. It started with a break in the wall, not Scarfo's, but his crew's. The Bureau had been working on the Scarfo family for years, watching from the edges, hoping someone would flinch. And then, someone did. A mid-level soldier named Nicky Crow Caramandi, got arrested on unrelated charges: gambling, extortion, the usual cocktail. But unlike others who'd worn out their knuckles protecting Scarfo's name, Caramandi didn't want to go down alone. He flipped, just like that, and once the dam cracked, the water didn't stop. One by one, associates began cooperating, first out of fear of prison, then out of fear of Scarfo himself. After all, if the boss could order hits on made men, underbosses, and even nephews, what chance did they have? The FBI began stitching together timelines, voices, transcripts. They started mapping his world. Who delivered envelopes on Thursdays, who picked up the veal cutlets every other Friday, who used the phrase "walk the dog" when discussing murder. Scarfo was still operating full speed, holding meetings, managing casino cuts, and dictating strategy from high-rises and union halls. But every word he said was being logged, time-stamped, and filed in manila folders marked with his name. One agent famously called it the most quotable mob boss in modern history. And then, in 1986, the trap was sprung. Scarfo was indicted on multiple charges: RICO violations, extortion, conspiracy, murder. It wasn't one big case, but a web of them, each thread leading back to a man who once thought silence was his best defense. Many people still think Scarfo could have walked free if he'd retired earlier, if he'd stopped after Atlantic City was sewn up. So what do you think? Does power ever let you leave peacefully? Or does it always ask for one more favor? Still, when the feds came for him, Scarfo didn't beg. He didn't panic. He didn't even raise his voice. He was arrested at his home in Ventnor, wearing a silk bathrobe and slippers. The agents found him seated at the table with a cold cup of coffee, staring out at the blinds as if he already knew this morning would come. At his arraignment, he smirked, not because he found it funny, but because he found it inevitable. The trials were long and public. Witnesses testified. Wiretaps played in courtrooms packed with reporters. The transcripts were like noir poetry, fragments of conversations so blunt they almost felt fictional. Scarfo sat quietly through most of it, occasionally scribbled notes, occasionally glared, always composed. But behind the scenes, things were unraveling. Phil Leonetti, his beloved nephew, his underboss, his shadow, flipped. It was the ultimate betrayal. Leonetti agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his testimony cracked the case wide open. He confirmed murders, named names, filled in gaps, explained what lunch with salt really meant. And it hurt, because if Scarfo had trusted anyone, it was Phil. He'd raised him in the life, groomed him, taught him everything from how to carry yourself in court to how to spot a double-crosser in a crowd. And now Phil sat on the other side of the courtroom, detailing his crimes like a priest in confession. Scarfo didn't yell, didn't cry, but those who were there said his face didn't move for the entire testimony, like stone. The convictions rolled in one after another. Scarfo was sentenced to 14 years for racketeering. Then more trials followed, more sentences. life. Eventually, he was transferred to a federal penitentiary in Atlanta. Even behind bars, he tried to run things. He passed notes, used visitors to send messages, wrote letters in code. But it wasn't the same. The empire was cracking. His men were gone, flipped, or buried. The money had dried up, and the silence he once weaponized had become his only companion. One historical note: Scarfo became one of the few American mafia bosses to die in prison without ever being paroled, released, or granted leniency. His entire final chapter played out behind concrete and wire. Still, in prison, he stayed true to himself. He walked with the same stiff posture, sat in the same corner of the yard every day, ate the same breakfast: hard-boiled eggs, toast, black coffee. One guard said, "He didn't age. He calcified, and he never confessed, even as more testimony piled up, even as more recordings emerged, even as the FBI printed diagrams showing who he ordered killed, when, and why." Scarfo maintained his innocence. He said only this: "They don't know what loyalty means." Not anymore, a simple sentence. But it echoed like a tombstone chiseled in regret. The concrete silence of prison didn't scare Nicodemo Scarfo. He had, after all, built his career on silence. What did unsettle him, what gnawed slowly at the corners of his mind, was irrelevance. That, more than any locked gate or barbed wire, was the true punishment. Because out there, in the world he once ruled by sheer force of will, new names were rising, new hands were shaking, and no one was asking what little Nicky thought anymore. His cell was small, modest even by federal standards. No view of the sea, no room for pacing. He kept a few books, mostly on war and Italian history. A copy of The Prince by Machiavelli rested beside a dictionary and a legal pad he rarely wrote on. His food came in plastic trays, and the only ceremony left in his life was choosing which half of the banana to eat first. And yet he refused to fade. Even behind bars, Scarfo tried to remain the boss. He instructed loyalists, what few remained, to keep operations going. He sent word through cryptic letters, often disguised as benign correspondence. A recipe here, a family anecdote there, all laced with messages only his closest men could decode. But the machine he'd built no longer ran on oil and fear. It needed fresh recruits, active rackets, new blood. And Scarfo, now confined and surrounded by metal echoes, couldn't provide those things anymore. The world outside had changed. The mafia wasn't what it had been in the 70s. Surveillance tech had improved. Informants were easier to flip. The public had grown less tolerant, and juries no longer feared retaliation. Even Atlantic City, his once private playground, had turned corporate. The boardwalk was now lined with security cameras, tax filings, and neon signs promoting family-friendly entertainment. No room for men like him. And then there were the betrayals. Personal ones. Men he'd trusted turned state's witness. Old friends stopped writing. His own son, Mark Scarfo, attempted suicide in the early 90s and was left in a vegetative state. The emotional collapse of his family hit Scarfo harder than any prison sentence ever could. He never spoke publicly about it, never addressed it in letters, but guards noticed the change. His morning walks became shorter. He stopped requesting his favorite foods from commissary. The fire that once fueled his every breath dimmed to a glow barely visible beneath layers of routine and resignation. And yet, even then, even as his body aged and his empire evaporated, he remained dangerous. One inmate who briefly shared a cell block with him said, "He had that look, like if they let him out tomorrow, he'd pick up right where he left off. You didn't talk around him. You didn't sleep deep. Scarfo still carried the same habits. Back always to the wall, conversations clipped, trust issued on a delay. He never mentioned names, never said anything twice. He read people like reports, scanning their shoes, their voices, the tilt of their heads, and if anyone tried to impress him, he'd simply raise one eyebrow and mutter, "You talk too fast." That was the end of the conversation. He was transferred more than once, often for administrative reasons, but some believed it was due to his efforts to reassert control behind bars. The Bureau of Prisons kept him shifting between high-security facilities, hoping to break up what influence remained, but it only cemented his legend. To new inmates, he was a curiosity. That guy? The one who ran Philly with a napkin and a glare? To guards, he was a protocol. To the system, a cautionary tale. One historical footnote. In the mid-2000s, Scarfo's name briefly resurfaced when his son, Nicodemo Scarfo Jr., was tied to a credit card fraud scheme involving members of the Lucchese crime family in New Jersey. Prosecutors speculated that Scarfo Sr. may have offered guidance, or at least inspiration, from his prison cell. Many people still think that Scarfo never really let go of the reins, that even when the lights dimmed, he found ways to flick the switches from afar. So, what do you think? Can a man like that ever truly retire? Or does the job just move into his bones? But bones break, and Scarfo's did. As the years wore on, age did what no FBI raid or rival crew could, softened him. His frame shrank further. His voice lost that edge. The man who once terrified cities now shuffled quietly to medical checkups and slept through loud televisions in common rooms. Still, the paranoia never left. One guard reported that Scarfo once asked to move cells because the shadows in the corner changed. Another said he woke up in the middle of the night just to make sure his door was still locked from the inside. Even in a world of cement and order, he couldn't silence the suspicion, because to Scarfo, the game never ended. It just slowed. And trust. That was still the most dangerous drug. He'd gone from a kid with a chip on his shoulder to a don with a city in his pocket. And now, to a whisper in a prison hallway. But even whispers echo, especially when they come from men who never apologized. Inside the gray corridors of the penitentiary, Nicodemo Scarfo's world grew smaller. Days bled into each other like overcooked pasta, soft, shapeless, indistinct. Breakfast, yard, lunch, cell, dinner, yard again, if the weather permitted. Lights out at 10 p.m., though Scarfo rarely needed the announcement. He'd learned long ago that nothing good ever happened after lights out. The man who once orchestrated empires now organized paperbacks. He requested books through the prison library, war memoirs, biographies of dictators, manuals on military strategy. And when asked what he liked about them, he simply said, "They don't stutter when giving orders." He never touched fiction. It wasn't that he couldn't suspend disbelief. He just didn't see the point. Even his few remaining visitors learned to curb small talk. If you sat across the bulletproof glass and brought up the past, "Hey, remember the old days?" He'd tilt his head and blink slowly, as if checking whether you'd said something useful or just nostalgic. Then he'd steer the conversation back to things that mattered. Who was out, who was rising, who was running their mouth. Because while Scarfo's body was trapped in cinder blocks and rules, his mind stayed sharp, suspiciously sharp. He kept tabs through whispers, legal documents, the rare newspaper clippings smuggled inside envelopes. Even retired agents would admit, Scarfo somehow always knew more than he should. Names of prosecutors transferred, cell changes before they were announced. Who was cooperating, even before plea deals became public, one agent said. He had antennae in places we didn't know had radios. But this intelligence brought little comfort. Most of what he heard now was loss. The old crew was gone. Some flipped, some faded. A few were buried in cemeteries he'd once picked out himself, their gravestones clean, their stories stained. And every year, Scarfo's name became less relevant. Another entry in mob history books, squeezed between more infamous names like Godi and Castellano, both of whom stole more headlines. And yet Scarfo wasn't forgotten. To the Bureau, he remained a symbol, a cautionary figure for trainees studying organized crime. His tapes, transcripts, and surveillance footage became training material. New agents sat in rooms, headphones on, listening to the cold way he discussed murder, the calculated pauses, the euphemisms that needed no translation. He was mob academia now, a historical fact. Scarfo's prosecution helped solidify the RICO Act as one of the FBI's most effective tools. His case, along with others in the 1980s, reshaped how organized crime was dismantled, not from the street up, but from the inside out. Paper trails and wiretaps, not Tommy guns and car chases. Many people still think that Scarfo, had he lived in a different decade, might have survived longer, hidden deeper. So what do you think? Was he undone by his brutality, or by the modern world catching up to his methods? Either way, time marched on, and Scarfo, once known for moving with quiet purpose, began slowing. He had minor strokes. His hands trembled slightly when he signed his name. He took longer to get out of bed, and sometimes he didn't. He refused a wheelchair for as long as he could, insisting he could manage with a cane, though he often leaned on the wall when no one was looking. Still, even as his body declined, his vanity endured. He kept his hair combed, trimmed his nails meticulously. He once reprimanded a guard who delivered his laundry wrinkled. "I ain't dead yet," he muttered. There was pride, yes, but also something deeper, an insistence that control, in whatever small way, still belonged to him. His appearance, his posture, his name, because names mattered to Scarfo. He often said, "What's the difference between a story and a reputation? One fades," and so he guarded his name with quiet desperation. When a prison magazine misspelled it in a footnote about mafia history, Scarfo wrote a letter to the warden. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even long. It just read, "Names are earned. Please don't misspell mine." Eventually, he was moved to the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina, a place where inmates were old, sick, or both. The rooms had a clinical quiet, more hospice than high security. Still, the guards who received him were warned. He's low movement, high alert. Don't mistake small for soft. Even then, even there, he carried himself like a man still waiting for the lights to go out mid-meal, for a shadow to move too fast across the floor. One evening, a fellow inmate wheeled past him and said, "You Scarfo?" He didn't answer. He just tapped his cane twice on the ground. As the years dragged into decades, Nicodemo Scarfo's world contracted to a few familiar hallways, a shared television in the common room, and the pale ceiling tiles of a medical unit that smelled faintly of antiseptic and canned fruit. The man once known for making entire crews disappear, with a glance now found himself monitored by nurses with clipboards and timesheets. The dignity he clung to, the posture, the tailored walk, the polished shoes, began to erode under the weight of time. His hands, once sharp and precise, now shook slightly when holding a spoon. His eyesight dimmed, and the once observant glint behind his gaze faded into something slower, more inward. But that didn't mean he had softened. No. Scarfo remained Scarfo. Even as his body betrayed him, his mind ticked like a locked vault. He still refused to talk loosely, still eyed every new arrival with quiet suspicion. still slept with his back to the wall, even though there were no more enemies, only nurses, shuffling slowly past his cell at night, their shoes whispering across linoleum. He didn't speak much in those final years. And when he did, it was with the kind of brevity that turned mundane questions into unnerving puzzles. A nurse once asked him if he needed anything. He replied, a different century. He would sit in his wheelchair near the window, not looking outside, but at the reflection of the hallway behind him. That habit never changed. If he couldn't face the door, he'd find a surface that let him track movement. He rarely smiled, but he'd nod at the guards who kept their distance, who didn't try too hard. He respected routine, even in a world that had long since removed his choices. Still, once in a while, a letter would come, from old associates, from distant relatives, sometimes even from total strangers. Wannabe mobsters or curious historians hoping for a reply. Most of them went unanswered, but there was one he held on to. It came from someone claiming to be the son of a former soldier in his crew. The boy had written, "My father used to say your word was law, that you never repeated yourself, that you never forgave, but he also said you were always fair." Was that true? Scarfo never wrote back, but he kept the letter, folded neatly, tucked between the pages of the prints, the same copy he'd carried for years. Many people still think that Scarfo went to his grave believing he'd done nothing wrong, not morally at least. He believed in order, in consequence, in loyalty. So what do you think? Is a man evil if he believes his rules kept worse chaos at bay? It's said that in the final months of his life, Scarfo began talking to himself more often. Not rambling, not delusional, just muttering under his breath. Names, dates, sometimes phrases in Italian. One nurse described him as a man forever solving a puzzle only he could see. He refused most visitors. Phil Leonetti never came. Neither did the few remaining men from his Atlantic City circle. In the end, Scarfo was surrounded not by allies or enemies, but by orderlies and time. His death came quietly on January 13th, 2017. Natural causes. He was 87. There was no ceremony, no grand farewell. His body was transported under supervision, buried with minimal attendees, and no mafia fanfare, no limousines, no black Cadillacs idling at the gates. Just a name, a date, and a silence thick enough to stretch across decades. The man who had once terrified a city was now just another inmate lost to time. But in Philadelphia and Atlantic City, his memory lingers like smoke in old stairwells, in union halls with creaky doors, in casinos where construction crews still talk about back in the day, in surveillance footage still archived under federal locks. There's an old story that one of the last things Scarfo said aloud was, "I walked through walls they never saw being built." Whether or not that's true, well, you already know how these stories go. Sometimes the most dangerous men leave the quietest footprints. In the years following Nicodemo Scarfo's death, there was no major tribute, no retrospectives on the evening news, no candlelit vigils or wise guys lowering their heads at the bar in unspoken mourning. Scarfo faded from the public consciousness like a shadow receding from a flame that had long since gone cold. But for those who remembered, those who had lived through the volatile reign of little Nicky, the echo of his era still rang in strange places. In South Philadelphia, some of the old social clubs still bore the residue of Scarfo's name. Not officially, of course. You wouldn't see a plaque, but you'd hear it in the way certain chairs stayed empty, in how men paused before speaking about the early 80s. Scarfo had turned the entire city into a chessboard, one where even the pawns had blood on their squares. You could still hear his name in union meetings too, though not with fear anymore, just caution. An old-timer might murmur, "Let's not have another Scarfo situation." And no one would ask what that meant. They just nodded. They knew the brutality of his reign wasn't just in body count, it was in tone. Scarfo normalized a kind of twitchy terror, a culture where men slept with phones unplugged, where every toast at dinner might double as a Last Supper, where meetings were structured less like strategy sessions and more like auditions for survival. And in Atlantic City, the glitz returned, but something else didn't. Scarfo had embedded himself so deeply into the foundation of that town that even decades later, stories still surfaced in contractor circles. A foundation poured too quickly. A building permit that mysteriously sailed through red tape. A now defunct pizzeria that used to close every Tuesday at 4. No one knew why, just that it was non-negotiable. You could argue Scarfo's legacy lived on not in headlines but in habits. Many people still think that Scarfo, even with his ferocity, accidentally taught law enforcement how to fight the mob more effectively than anyone before him. So what do you think? Was he a cautionary tale for criminals? Or the final proof that no empire built on fear can survive its architect? His tapes, now digitized, became lecture material at the FBI Academy. Young agents studied his cadence, how he issued death sentences between spoonfuls of pasta, how his silences often said more than his orders. Even phrases like, "We'll take care of it," or "He's not with us anymore," became case studies in coded language. In many ways, Scarfo became a textbook, not a myth. But it wasn't all federal files and mob lore. In certain corners of South Philly, there were still men, older now, grayer, quieter, who held on to a different version of Scarfo. They remembered a man who paid for a kid's braces because his father couldn't. A man who tipped waiters $100 just for bringing coffee hot. A man who, for all his demons, believed in rules. Rigid, brutal, often fatal rules, but rules nonetheless. One barber remembered him vividly. He used to come in on Wednesdays, sat in the chair by the window, never took the cape, said he liked to see his hands. You'd ask him how short, he'd just say, "Clean. Nothing fancy, just clean." I gave him the same cut for 15 years. And when asked if he missed him, the barber just shrugged and said, "I miss people who don't repeat themselves." Even that felt like a Scarfo lesson. By 2220, a new generation had taken over the Philadelphia underworld. They were quieter, more corporate in their dealings, less fond of flamboyant violence. But the elders reminded them of a time when one man could freeze a room without raising his voice. A time when Atlantic City had a ghost patrolling its boardwalk in loafers and suspicion. Phil Leonetti, Scarfo's nephew and former underboss, went on to live a different life, one of witness protection, book deals, interviews. His testimony had destroyed the very empire that once fed him. But even Leonetti, in his candid moments, admitted that Scarfo was the most terrifying man I've ever known, not because he was loud, but because he never needed to be. And that silence? It still walks behind closed doors in neighborhoods where wise guys once made eye contact and negotiation. There are no statues, no gravestone where flowers are laid each January. But in the mob's oral tradition, little Nicky's story is still told, with hesitation, with a glance over the shoulder, and always with lowered voices. Because if Scarfo taught the world anything, it's that the quiet ones, they're the ones you watch closest. If you ask around South Jersey today, really ask, behind the convenience store counters, beneath the chatter of union halls, you'll still find traces of Nicodemo Scarfo. Not in plaques or memorials, but in lowered voices, in eyes that narrow when the name comes up. His ghost, it seems, doesn't walk with chains. It wears loafers and leaves no footprints, because little Nicky didn't just rule with fear. He taught fear how to walk upright. One thing most people forget is just how small his empire really was, in numbers. His inner circle never stretched beyond a few dozen men. His trusted lieutenants? Fewer still. And yet, the reach of his paranoia, his decisions, his temper, it stretched across neighborhoods, unions, even courtrooms. At the peak of his power, a single phone call from Scarfo could halt a construction project, cancel a political fundraiser, or change a man's fate by sundown. That wasn't just muscle. That was theater. It was control, and Scarfo knew it. He once said to a close associate, "You don't need to be the biggest. You just need to make them think you're everywhere." That, perhaps more than anything, defined his rule. He didn't need eyes in every room, just the rumor that they might be there. It worked on judges, on prosecutors, on cops, even on his own men, who spoke to each other in second-hand glances and coded grunts, because nobody wanted to be the guy who said too much. Not again. There's a story, one that made the rounds in the early 2000s, about a low-level mob associate who claimed he'd once delivered a package to Scarfo in the early 80s. Just a simple envelope drop. But when he arrived, he said Scarfo didn't speak, didn't gesture, just stared at him for 7 seconds, then turned and walked away. The associate claimed he never forgot that stare. He got out of the life the next year. Even decades later, men remembered how it felt to be evaluated by Scarfo. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it lingered, like a decision that hadn't yet been made, but soon would be. Scarfo didn't inspire admiration. He inspired compliance. That's an important distinction. And while other mob bosses chased headlines or played the press, John Gotti with his overcoats and smiles, for example, Scarfo recoiled from the spotlight. He didn't want to be liked. He wanted to be assumed. He wore pastel suits not to draw attention, but to contrast the darkness he carried inside. He cracked dry jokes that no one dared laugh too hard at, and when a reporter once tried to interview him outside a courthouse, Scarfo replied, "If I needed to explain myself, you wouldn't be qualified to hear it." He wasn't poetic, but he was precise. Many people still think Scarfo was born in the wrong era, that had he come up during Luciano's time, or under Capone, he would have thrived in their codes and chaos. But others argue the opposite, that Scarfo needed the modern world, that he was born into the era of wiretaps and informants because only then could his obsession with control truly matter. So what do you think? Was Scarfo a man out of time, or the only man who truly understood his own? What's undeniable is the way he shaped the Philadelphia mob. Before Scarfo, the Bruno family had been known for relative peace. After Scarfo, it was synonymous with blood. His reign redefined expectations. No longer was a made man safe just by swearing loyalty. He had to prove it. Daily, visibly, Scarfo demanded performance. A made guy who hadn't moved the needle in 6 months? He was watched. A capo who got too friendly with outsiders? Watched harder. Even whispers of hesitation became actionable intelligence. And when a man finally vanished, no one asked why. They just nodded. Like the end of a sentence, everyone was too tired to finish. This culture didn't just disappear when Scarfo went to prison. It lingered. Through the 1990s and early 2000s, successors still operated in his shadow. Some tried to bring back the Bruno style. Quiet, economic, diplomatic. But Scarfo's specter was always close behind, reminding them what happened when peace was mistaken for weakness. And though he never ruled again after his conviction, Scarfo's influence stayed embedded like old rebar in cracked concrete. Even the FBI, in their internal documents, often used his case as a framework, not just for how to catch a mobster, but for how to understand one. The routines, the rituals, the way fear was folded into every handshake, every dinner, every pause in conversation. In his later years, Scarfo's health may have failed, but his legend stayed intact because he didn't need to be remembered by the public. He just needed to be remembered by the men who came after, and they remembered. Even now, in federal lockups, when a young inmate starts puffing up too loudly, an old-timer might mutter, "He thinks he's Scarfo," and everyone understands what that means. It doesn't mean strong. It doesn't mean smart. It means dangerous, unrelenting, and above all, alone. They called him the little guy, the quiet one, the pajama don. Names whispered half with fear, half with disbelief that someone so compact, so unassuming in stature, could cast such a long and disquieting shadow over an entire city. But that was Scarfo's secret all along. He didn't need height. He needed hesitation. And that hesitation, those half-second pauses when people decided whether to speak, was where he found his power. He never yelled to be heard. He never pointed to be followed. He didn't have to. Scarfo's presence was gravity, and for years it bent every room he entered. But by the end of his story, that gravity had begun to unwind. Slowly, then all at once. In the final months of his life at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina, Scarfo barely spoke. His world had narrowed to the rhythm of nurses' shoes on linoleum, the soft click of medication carts, and the low murmur of TVs broadcasting to no one in particular. He was surrounded by men much like him, men who had once commanded fear and now waited, quietly, for breakfast trays and sunset. One nurse remembered seeing him sit for hours, unmoving, eyes fixed not on the present, but on a place years behind him. Maybe a booth in Atlantic City, a back room in South Philly, a diner that served coffee just the way he liked it, no sugar. Maybe he was counting something. Maybe he was unmaking it. He died without fanfare. No media swarm, no teary entourage. Just a man in a thin federal-issued blanket, exhaling once more, then never again. And now, this is where we slow. We step back from the courtrooms and wiretaps, from casino floors and blinking street lamps, from voices speaking in code and friends too scared to ask questions. Instead, we soften. Imagine the boardwalk after midnight, the tourists long gone, the air thick with ocean salt and neon fog, wooden planks creaking under no one's footsteps, a lone seagull circling overhead, silent, waiting, a world that used to hum with tension, now bathed in stillness. That's where Scarfo lingers, not in glory, not in guilt, just there, somewhere between a whisper and a warning. He is not a man you'll meet again, not in boardrooms, not in back alleys, not even in prison yards. Because men like Scarfo weren't designed to last. They were designed to burn, and in burning, leave just enough ash behind to remind us fear doesn't raise its voice. It waits. Now. Let your thoughts loosen. Let the names fade. Let the flickering casino lights go out, one by one, until nothing's left but hush. Your breathing has already slowed, your muscles untied. The story has folded in on itself like the last line of a confession never spoken. Let go of the cold grip of the sidewalk, sink into softness. The only loyalty that matters now is the one between you and rest. It's quiet now, the kind Scarfo would have understood. The wind off the Atlantic once carried Nicodemo Scarfo's name through every alley of South Philadelphia. But after his death, it was a different kind of name that echoed, one no longer spoken in fear, but dissected in interviews, in court transcripts, in law school lectures. The man who ruled through silence had become a story told with bullet points, redacted memos, and the occasional grim smirk from someone who knew him once. But stories told after the fact have a way of softening their subjects, sanding off the rougher edges, giving even the most brutal men a sheen of cinematic myth. Not Scarfo. He didn't die mysterious. He died remembered. Not beloved, not mourned, just known. That in many ways was all he ever asked for, because Scarfo didn't crave fame the way other mobsters did. He didn't dress for headlines. He didn't court cameras or flash rings in courtrooms. His performances weren't for the public. They were for the room, for the few people close enough to realize just how little emotion he allowed himself. And it was in that refusal, that repression, that his power became absolute. His enemies called him unpredictable. His friends, what few survived, called him disciplined. His own family, in their quieter moments, called him tired. During one of his many trials, the court stenographer reportedly paused after Scarfo said the phrase, "I trust routine more than I trust people." She had to check if he'd meant it literally, or as a figure of speech. He had meant it literally. Scarfo's daily rituals had once been tools of control. Who he saw when he ate, where he parked. But in prison, they became reminders. That, even locked away, he could still choose how he faced a cup of coffee. That no one, not even the Bureau of Prisons, could rearrange the lines of his morning. And as the years passed, many of the men who'd feared him began to view Scarfo as a kind of symbol, a cautionary shape cut from old newspapers, a man who reached too high, squeezed too hard, and ended up with nothing but fractured alliances and a legacy carved into court filings. Still, in some corners, his name was uttered with a different tone. Not admiration, not nostalgia, but a kind of grim reverence, because while he may not have built an empire to last, he built one that taught. And the lesson was simple. Fear works until it doesn't. Phil Leonetti, his nephew and once loyal underboss, had long since disappeared into the witness protection program, surfacing occasionally to give interviews. In one such appearance, Leonetti said, "I loved him, I feared him, and I'm not sure I ever knew him." That statement lingered with listeners. How can you love a man you don't know? How can you fear someone who tucks you into the life and then leaves you stranded in it? Leonetti had killed for Scarfo, lied for him, bled for him, and then, like so many before him, he'd left him. Not because he wanted to, but because Scarfo's version of loyalty had an expiration date. One you couldn't read until the day it arrived. Many people still think that Scarfo's real failure wasn't murder or greed, but loneliness. So what do you think? Can a man who builds walls instead of bridges ever die anything but alone? Because that's how it ended. One man, one room, one silence too heavy for even the orderlies to carry. After Scarfo's death, a few newspapers ran brief obituaries. Most focused on his criminal legacy, his body count, the sheer audacity of his cruelty. But one local columnist in Atlantic City wrote something different. A short piece titled, "The Man Who Looked at You Like He Already Knew the End." In it, the writer described seeing Scarfo once, in the early 80s, walking into a diner, not flanked by bodyguards, not barked at by cops, just him, alone, calm, sitting at a booth, back to the wall, ordering eggs and rye toast like a man who had nowhere to be, but still didn't trust you to sit behind him. That's how Scarfo left his mark, not by being loud, but by being noticed in silence. And now, with his story mostly written, the spaces he once occupied feel different. The diner is gone. The casino he once skimmed from has been remodeled. The back rooms where he gave orders now smell like old carpet and broken heating vents. But every so often someone will pause, someone who knows, and they'll say, This is where little Nicky used to sit, not fondly, not regretfully, just like a fact that needs saying. In the quiet aftermath of Nicodemo Scarfo's long, crumbling reign, something peculiar happened. Something that often follows the downfall of men like him. The myth began to splinter into two. There was the Scarfo of courtroom documents, of redacted files, of mugshots and wiretap transcripts, a man of measurable crimes and sentences. And then there was little Nicky, the whispered version, passed around by aging wise guys over bad coffee and too many cigarettes, the version polished by memory, sharpened by fear, and blurred by time. A man less real than remembered, and as is often the case in mafia history, it was the second version, the ghost, that lingered longer. In Philadelphia, kids who weren't even born during Scarfo's heyday grew up hearing the name from their uncles. You think you got problems? You should have lived through Nicky's time. The stories they told didn't need to be true. They just needed to be useful, because even in death, Scarfo served as a warning, one that didn't need shouting. The most terrifying leaders rarely bark. It's the whisper you remember. And Scarfo's whisper had once turned boardwalks into minefields and breakfast diners into courtrooms without judges. That influence doesn't vanish. It seeps into walls, into habits, into pauses in conversation. Even law enforcement felt it. Many of the agents who had chased him, wiretapped him, eventually retired, but they trained others, passed down the files, shared stories of how Scarfo never called a hit, or how he used 3 different phones to make one phone call. Some of the younger agents rolled their eyes until they heard the tapes, the way Scarfo said, "Handle it," without raising his voice, how a chuckle could be more threatening than a threat. Scarfo had perfected menace without volume, and that became his legacy. Not a monument, but a methodology. In the years after his death, documentaries began to surface. Low-budget retrospectives with titles like Scarfo, the Don Who Didn't Blink. Former crew members were interviewed from behind shadows or grainy voice distortion. Journalists debated whether Scarfo was paranoid or just painfully precise. One mainstream historian offered a curious take. Scarfo didn't just commit crimes. He curated consequences, because for Scarfo, every action had a reply. If a man missed a meeting, someone missed him. If money came in light, lights went out. It wasn't emotional, it was math. Scarfo believed in balance, in scorekeeping. And if you disrupted the equation, he erased you from it. Even now, court cases reference his leadership style. In a 2021 sentencing for a modern-day mob figure in New Jersey, the judge remarked, "We are no longer in the days of Scarfo. This court does not operate under fear." But the mention proved the point. His name still held weight, still drew lines in courtroom air, still made prosecutors sit up straighter, even if the man himself had long since been buried under government headcounts and yellowing files. His son, Nicodemo Jr., continued to dance with law enforcement over the years, more white-collar than wise guy, but still carrying the name like a fingerprint you can't scrub off. But the truth is, there was only ever one Scarfo that mattered, and by the time his lungs gave out in federal custody, that Scarfo had become almost entirely legend. But legends aren't about accuracy, they're about function. And for certain generations in Philadelphia and Atlantic City, Scarfo's function was clear. He was the story you told when someone got too confident, when someone thought respect could be demanded without earning it, when a young guy cracked wise in the wrong bar and needed reminding that silence was once more powerful than swagger. Many people still think the mob changed because of Scarfo, that his scorched earth leadership proved unsustainable. So what do you think? Can terror alone keep a family standing? Or does it guarantee its collapse? Either way, Scarfo's rise and fall became the pivot. Before him, the Philadelphia family was feared. After him, it was fractured. And every boss who came after inherited the paranoia, the echoes, the sense that somewhere in the room, Scarfo had already read your thoughts. One final story. A retired FBI agent once returned to Philadelphia to speak at a seminar on organized crime. During the Q&A, someone asked who the most frightening mobster he'd ever dealt with was. He didn't hesitate. Scarfo, he said, because you never saw him coming. But when he left, you didn't forget the way the air changed. And then he added, almost to himself, still gives me chills. By the time the 2010s rolled in and Scarfo's name became less a threat and more a trivia fact, there was a curious transformation taking place. Not just in the streets he once ruled, but in the public's relationship to the mafia itself. The mob had become content. TV series, documentaries, podcasts. Suddenly, everyone had a take, an angle, a theme song. Crime families were discussed not just in courtrooms, but in Reddit threads, in streaming specials with dramatic reenactments, and in neighborhood tours of where it all went down. But Scarfo? He didn't fit the mold. There were no charming interviews, no grainy video clips of him laughing in court, no sound bites worth turning into memes. He wasn't cinematic. He wasn't telegenic. He was real in the most uncomfortable way. Too sharp to glamorize, too brutal to soften. Scarfo couldn't be neatly packaged into a lovable anti-hero. And maybe that's why, even now, his story lives in a different register. You don't binge-watch Scarfo. You study him. You feel him in the way a room changes when someone shifts their tone, in the way tension lingers a second too long after someone says, back in the day, you couldn't get away with that. That legacy, less a name, more a presence, is what makes him unique among mob bosses. He never needed to leave behind a structure, just a sensation, one that outlived the casinos, the trial footage, even the men who once trembled at his nod. In fact, some of the most revealing glimpses into Scarfo's nature didn't come from his rivals or the FBI, but from his victims. Not the dead, those he left behind in alleyways and parking garages, but the living victims, men who survived him, who worked under him, who left the life and now lived in quiet towns, watching their backs anyway. One such man, decades later, was interviewed under heavy anonymity. He'd served time, flipped, and was now working construction somewhere in the Midwest. He didn't miss the life. But when asked about Scarfo, he paused. People didn't understand what it meant to be under him. He said, it wasn't just fear. It was fatigue. He made you afraid to breathe the wrong way. You woke up scared and went to sleep scared. Eventually, you forgot what a calm day felt like. And when the interviewer asked, was he a good boss? The man shook his head. He was the last boss you needed, not the first you wanted. That line stuck, because for all his blood and paranoia, Scarfo had accomplished something few in the mob world ever do. He ended up defining an entire decade of East Coast organized crime. From the early 1980s to his arrest in the mid-80s, he ruled like a despot, not with warmth or tradition, but with calculation. He didn't romanticize omerta. He weaponized it, turned silence from a code into a tool, into a sword. Many people still think that Scarfo accelerated the death of the mafia by pushing it too far, too fast. So what do you think? Was he a man trying to survive a decaying system, or the very reason it started decaying? Because while Scarfo was locking down unions and skimming casino profits, law enforcement was evolving. They had better wiretaps, more aggressive prosecutors, witness protection, and Scarfo, in his relentless effort to maintain order, gave them exactly what they needed: a trail of bodies, a culture of fear, and a dozen bitter men with names and stories and nothing left to lose. That was his Achilles heel. Not pride, not greed, predictability. Once the FBI knew how he ruled, who he trusted, how he responded, how often he eliminated risk, they simply waited for the rhythm to repeat. And it always did. Scarfo never adjusted. He couldn't. His entire belief system was rooted in routine. That was both his armor and his cage. In the final accounting of his life, he died behind bars, estranged, feared, misunderstood. The world had moved on. The streets he once walked now patrolled by cameras and code enforcement, rather than whispered orders. But if you find yourself in Atlantic City late at night, long after the slot machines quiet and the boardwalk empties out, you might still feel it. That pressure, that trace of something just beyond the neon glow, as if somewhere nearby a man is watching, measuring, deciding, and just maybe nodding once, slow, subtle, and final. Long after Nicodemo Scarfo was buried, his grave marked quietly, no ceremony, no crowd. The impact of his reign remained etched in the architecture of fear he left behind. Not in bricks or blueprints, but in the way doors still locked a little quicker in South Philly, in the way stories were told without names, in how people, even years later, still looked over their shoulder, not because he was coming, but because someone once had. Scarfo didn't create the Philadelphia mob, but he changed its posture, gutted it of grace, and turned a once diplomatic family into a house with blood on every floorboard. The aftermath wasn't immediate. It was slow erosion. By the early 1990s, the Philadelphia family was fractured. Factions had splintered. Leadership bounced between faces no one feared quite the same way. Scarfo had ruled with such intensity that no successor could maintain the pace. Some tried, most failed. A few didn't live long enough to try again. And law enforcement? They adapted, learned. Scarfo had, unintentionally, trained them. The Scarfo era gave birth to new policies, new informant protections, tighter RICO applications. He had made himself the blueprint for federal takedown procedures. His crimes weren't just prosecuted, they were studied. Internal memos in the FBI circulated with phrases like Scarfo protocols when describing how to monitor family structures and decode mob speak. In that sense, Scarfo's legacy was paradoxical. He had wanted to be untouchable. Instead, he became the case study for how to touch the untouchable. But in the silence of those years, behind the statistics and the transcripts, lingered something harder to quantify: the psychic debt. The mental toll on men who had lived in his shadow for too long. Some retired quietly. Others vanished. A few never recovered. There were stories of wise guys waking in cold sweats in witness protection, long after Scarfo had been locked away. Of men who refused to answer the phone if it rang twice in a row, who checked their rearview mirror even in grocery store parking lots. Because you never just worked for Scarfo, you survived him. One of his former drivers, now in his 70s, once gave a rare interview. Sitting in a diner far from Philly, the man stirred his coffee and said, "You didn't understand. Nicky didn't make you scared. He made you careful. Every day, every call. You were never allowed to forget that one mistake could be your last." Even on your day off, the interviewer asked him if he'd ever felt safe. He chuckled. "Safe? You kidding? You don't work with Nicky and feel safe. You feel compliant. That's the best you get." And isn't that what Scarfo wanted all along? Not love, not even loyalty, obedience. There's a kind of violence in obedience. Not the kind with blood, but the kind that breaks posture, that shortens a man's sentences, that teaches him to say less, feel less, want less. That was Scarfo's real weapon. He didn't just control your actions. He altered your instincts. Even today, among aging mob historians, Scarfo is described differently. Gotti, charismatic. Luciano, strategic. Scarfo, precise, cold, an operator. Many people still think Scarfo would have thrived in politics had he chosen a different route. So, what do you think? Could a man that feared exposure have ever survived in public office? Or would he have brought the shadows with him, even under the brightest lights? Because shadows were his currency, the unsaid, the undone. He once told an associate, "You don't win by being loud. You win by making them wonder what else you know." That line stuck around. It still gets quoted, quietly, by men who remember, or men who pretend they do. And Scarfo, he never needed a monument. His legacy was built in unfinished sentences, in glances that meant more than full confessions. He ruled not through proclamations, but through the kind of calibrated silence that made men fold their napkins slower and check the locks twice before bed. In a world of big mouths and loud jackets, Scarfo remained the quietest man in the room. And somehow, he was the most dangerous one. That kind of legacy doesn't leave loudly. It leaks, like steam from old pipes in an alley you shouldn't walk down. Even now, decades later, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and FBI agents speak of the Scarfo standard. Not because he was the best or the most profitable, but because he turned fear into policy. After his death, there were no pilgrimages to his grave, no black Cadillacs idling along the cemetery lane, but there were still conversations, half-formed and reluctantly shared, between men in diners, garages, and old union offices. They don't say his name casually. It arrives slow, like a cough held too long, because no one really wanted to talk about Scarfo, not because they feared him now, but because they remembered what it was like when they did. What made Scarfo different wasn't just the bodies. Others killed more. It wasn't the money. Others stole more. It was that he felt smaller than the world he dominated. He shouldn't have been the one on top. And yet, there he stood, controlling men twice his size, twice as loud, and 3 times as unstable. He did it with posture, with timing, with a brutal understanding of how long to wait before moving, and when to never move at all. That's the part that's hardest to explain to those who didn't live through it. The fear didn't come from his gun. It came from the pause that preceded it, the moment when Scarfo would tilt his head, say nothing, let the silence hang. That's when your stomach dropped, because you realized he didn't need to say anything. You were already in free fall. Many people still think Scarfo could have died free. Had he stopped earlier, pulled back, let others take the heat. But that was never him. So, what do you think? Is it strength to walk away, or weakness to need to stay king until the end? Because Scarfo didn't want peace. He didn't seek rest. He required control, even when everything else was slipping. In one of his final recorded conversations, captured years before his death, but long after his prime, he told an associate, "The only way to know they won't betray you is to get rid of the idea they ever could." That line, cold and clean, was Scarfo in a sentence. There's no romance in that, no operatic fall, just a man who outlasted his usefulness and never forgave the world for it. The world, in turn, never forgot him, not fondly, but firmly. His was not a name that floated. It pressed. And even today, as new faces rise and new rackets unfold, his methods still haunt the margins, still serve as a benchmark for how fear can be refined into something almost elegant, not flashy, just final. And in the end, maybe that's what Nicodemo Scarfo always intended. Not to be admired, just remembered. After a reign so tightly coiled in fear and precision, the name Scarfo slowly became shorthand, not for power, but for paranoia. And yet, in every cautionary tale whispered through the underworld, his influence hummed just beneath the surface. In the decades following his imprisonment and eventual death, Philadelphia's underworld changed. New faces, new alliances, new rules. But the long shadow of Scarfo lingered, not because anyone wanted to be like him, but because no one could forget him. And in this way, Scarfo became a paradox, both a template and a warning. You could trace it in how successors carried themselves. Gone were the loud suits and headline-chasing egos. Post-Scarfo bosses walked quieter, talked less, measured more, not out of reverence, but recovery. The city had to recalibrate after him. One mob historian described it like this: Scarfo ruled like a fever. You don't admire it. You just remember how it made everything ache. Still, some tried to resurrect his way. New blood, eager to prove themselves, would study his legend like scripture. They copied his suspicion, his tight command structure, even his stoic demeanor. But imitation only gets you so far, because what they couldn't replicate was the time. Scarfo didn't just operate within a system, he was the system. His rise came when Atlantic City was being reborn, when unions were ripe for takeover, when technology hadn't yet caught up with ambition. And his fall? That was technology catching up. Wiretaps, RICO, turning soldiers into storytellers. What Scarfo taught the world, more than anything else, was this: absolute control is a lie. He lived as if he could calculate loyalty like a balance sheet, eliminate risk like bad debt. But people aren't spreadsheets. They panic, they fear, they flip. And Scarfo, for all his intelligence, never truly accepted that, which is why his empire, so tightly wound, exploded from the inside. And yet, his tactics persist. Modern crime families still use his tricks. Silent meetings in noisy restaurants, rotating phones, layered buffers between boss and business. These weren't innovations. They were habits he perfected. In a way, he left behind a playbook. Not one you'd want to follow, but one you had to understand. One former FBI agent, now retired, keeps a photograph of Scarfo pinned to a corkboard in his home office. Not out of sentiment, but as a reminder. He once said, "That guy taught us how deep silence can go. When someone stops talking, that's when you lean in the hardest." Scarfo taught everyone to listen. Even now, in law enforcement training seminars, his name still pops up, not just as a criminal, but as an architect of dread. And dread, unlike violence, doesn't need to be explained. It just needs to be felt. Scarfo knew that. He relied on it. He didn't need to raise his voice. He just needed the room to hold its breath long enough to understand what might happen next. Many people still think Scarfo's greatest weapon wasn't a gun or a crew. It was his ability to make normal feel dangerous. So, what do you think? Is that leadership or pathology? Because at some point, the man and the myth became indistinguishable. His legacy isn't in what he built, but in what others still walk around, too cautious to rebuild. Even in prison, he never surrendered his sense of structure. His letters to associates were clinical, his routines baldly enforced. He still ate at the same time, still requested the same items from commissary, still shaved the same way, not for comfort, but for control. Control was his last possession, and when that, too, eroded, when his hands shook, when his eyesight dimmed, when even his words lost their weight, Scarfo didn't adapt. He receded into quiet, into routine, into legend. And as the years pass, his name becomes less recalled than invoked, by writers, by agents, by criminals who know the difference between danger and drama. Because Scarfo, he wasn't theater, he was warning. As the decades passed and organized crime continued to evolve, changing with the digital age, adopting newer schemes with lower risks and higher firewalls, the men of the Scarfo generation became ghosts. Not just because they died, but because their methods no longer fit in a world that no longer relied on fear in the same currency. Nicodemo Scarfo belonged to a time when menace was analog, when a look could be an order, and a pause could be a sentence. Today, the underworld whispers through VPNs, burner apps, crypto wallets. But back then, it passed through glances, ashtrays, and envelopes. And while those envelopes are mostly gone, the memory of what they once held still lingers in Philly, in old union halls with ceilings stained from decades of smoke, where Scarfo's name doesn't echo, it settles, like dust no one wants to disturb. Yet for all his paranoia, all his effort to control outcomes, Scarfo never controlled his story. Once the indictments came, the testimonies mounted, and the cameras rolled into courtrooms, his legend stopped being his to shape. The FBI shaped it. The newspapers shaped it. Later, historians and screenwriters tried their hand, and Scarfo, once obsessed with precision, became a man summarized in pull quotes. Tiny Don with a bloody legacy, the butcher of Atlantic City, a whisper in a silk suit. He'd have hated that last one, too poetic, too soft, because Scarfo never wanted to be misunderstood. He wanted to be unmistakable, to be clear. But clarity didn't save him. One curious detail from his prison years. Scarfo kept an old typewriter in his cell during the early 2000s. Not because he was writing memoirs, he wasn't the confessional type, but because he trusted keys more than touchscreens. Every sentence he typed was deliberate, short, measured. He typed like a man counting bullets. Most of the pages were torn up. He didn't believe in drafts. He believed in finality. One prison guard said, "He wrote like he talked, and when he stopped, it felt like you'd done something wrong." That sense of control, down to punctuation, defined him. It kept him alive longer than most. It also left him completely alone, because while men obeyed Scarfo, very few liked him, and even fewer loved him. He didn't allow for intimacy. He saw affection as risk, warmth as weakness, which meant, by the end, the only people who remembered him warmly were the ones who never knew him. That's the cruel math of men like Scarfo. You spend your life mastering fear, only to be remembered by those you didn't intend to impress. Still, the machinery he helped design, the systems of silence, coded language, overlapping hierarchies, disposable middlemen, remain in use. His paranoia was ahead of its time. Today's crime syndicates may use digital channels, but many still follow Scarfo's rules. Limit exposure. Compartmentalize everything, and never trust the second handshake more than the first. Many people still think Scarfo was the last true boss in Philadelphia. The final ruler who didn't smile for cameras, didn't talk out of turn, didn't leave his seat until the message had been received. So what do you think? Is legacy about results or fear remembered? Because Scarfo left few results you can tour. No mansions, no plaques, no family dynasty. His empire wasn't built in marble or neon. It was built in the space between actions. It lived in hesitation, and maybe that's why, when former associates look back, they don't talk about him like a king. They talk about him like a force. Not someone you worked for, but someone you worked around. A man whose approval felt like relief, and whose silence felt like danger. Even now, in the footnotes of modern mafia history, Scarfo's section always reads differently. Less like a rise and fall, more like a storm chart, a pattern of pressure and collapse. He didn't build a family. He extracted obedience from one. And that distinction, that's what makes his shadow so heavy. By the time Scarfo's story had settled into legend, long after the blood dried and the courtrooms emptied, a strange thing happened. His name began appearing in places he would have hated. College lecture halls, podcasts hosted by guys in hoodies, listicles about top 10 ruthless mob bosses, and in every case his story was sanded down just enough to make it marketable. Gone were the moments of crushing silence. Gone were the ruined men who flinched at doorbells. Gone was the quiet terror of not knowing if you'd be called again tomorrow, or never again. What remained was a caricature, a short man with a long temper, a boss in 2 bright suits, a tyrant who once made Philadelphia hold its breath for nearly a decade. And yet, even in this diluted version, people leaned in, because something about Scarfo still resisted simplification. He wasn't dramatic like Gotti. He didn't die in a blaze like Castellano. He didn't vanish like Jimmy Hoffa. Scarfo stayed, sat in his cell, aged like steel, never rusting, just slowly cooling to room temperature. And for those who did know him, the real ones, they still tread carefully when remembering him. A former union rep, long since retired, once said in an interview, "You didn't talk to Nicky, you passed messages. Talking meant he'd remember your voice, and you didn't want that. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't admiration, it was something colder, preservation." Scarfo had been a boss who didn't need you to love him, didn't need your handshake or loyalty oaths. He needed your reflexes. He needed you to know that any misstep, however small, would cost something. And maybe that's why his story never quite became folklore, because folklore needs a hero. Scarfo didn't offer that. He offered calculation, and the damage left behind wasn't just in the broken bodies, the dead captains, or the frightened families. It was in the tone of an entire era, in the culture of suspicion that followed, even in retirement communities far from South Philly. Men who once sat at Scarfo's tables still checked their windows twice at night. Not because he was coming, but because he once might have. His method, his ethic, never left them. He had reprogrammed their instincts. That's power beyond position. That's legacy without consent. And many people still think Scarfo's story is one of failure, that his empire collapsed, his family scattered, his bloodline tainted. But others argue, what if that was the plan? Not to last, but to leave a scar. Because when a man like Scarfo operates, he doesn't build monuments, he builds silence. He builds that hesitation in the back of your throat, that feeling when the air gets just a little too still before the reply. And now, decades after his last order, his last phone call, his last stare, the silence still lingers. One final story floats through certain corners of Atlantic City. An old janitor at a casino, now long since torn down, claimed he once walked past a back room where Scarfo sat alone at a table, staring at a map of the city. No one else around. No talking, just the boss, a finger resting on Pacific Avenue. The janitor, shaking slightly, asked if he needed anything. Scarfo looked up. "No," he said. "I already know where everything ends." The final traces of Nicodemo Scarfo's life now live mostly in red folders, archived files in basement vaults of government buildings, evidence logs, transcripts, surveillance summaries typed on yellowing paper. And though his body is buried in a place few ever visit, his life is still dissected in conferences, true crime books, and late-night interviews with ex-associates who once swore they'd never talk. But here's what none of the paperwork captures: the texture of Scarfo's era, the way conversations would shift when his name came up, the way even men known for their ruthlessness would lower their voices, not out of superstition, but because Scarfo had that rare talent of lingering. He left behind a fear so specific it had a half-life. There are men walking around today who haven't seen Scarfo in 40 years, yet still hesitate before telling a story that includes him. Not because he'll come back, but because, somehow, they believe he might already know. That's not criminality. That's architecture. Scarfo built a feeling. Not a family, not a future, but a vibration in the air that said, nothing is off limits, and no one is too close. And the ultimate tragedy? He wasn't wrong. He was betrayed not just by enemies, but by his own nephew. Flipped. Testified. Stripped the Scarfo myth down to ledger entries and lunch table orders. It was, for Scarfo, the kind of betrayal that validated every ounce of his paranoia. He'd built a world where no one was safe, especially from him, and eventually no one was. Even he wasn't spared. Prison was never supposed to be his end. Men like Scarfo don't imagine concrete walls. They imagine chairs at corner tables, influence passed by nod, loyalty sealed in silence. But his final years were anything but elegant. The body broke. The voice shrank. The eyes that once ruled a room now struggled to read prescriptions. He'd outlived everyone he trusted. And still, the silence stayed. A nurse at FMC Butner, who tended to him in the last year of his life, recalled how he'd sit with a towel over his lap, hands clasped tight, watching the wall. Not TV, not other inmates, just the wall. One day, she asked him if he wanted the channel changed. He shook his head once and said, "The noise doesn't change anything." That was Scarfo. Even as his body dimmed, his mind stayed fixed on control, on order, on the rituals that once gave him dominion over cities. He couldn't bear disorder, not in conversation, not in breakfast trays, not in how people folded napkins. He wasn't nostalgic. He was still planning, even if there was no plan left to execute. And that's what separates Scarfo from most mob bosses. He didn't just seek power. He feared not having it. Every decision he made, every call, every death was about retaining control of the narrative. And yet, in the end, he couldn't. Many people still think that's what broke him. Not the prison, not the betrayal, but the loss of authorship over his own myth. So what do you think? Is a man truly defeated when he's caged? Or when someone else finishes his sentence? Because Scarfo's story was finished. By Leonetti, by the feds, by the public, by everyone but him. And now it's told by strangers. Strangers who never feared him. Strangers who know the dates, but not the chills. Still, somewhere in South Philly, a man walks past a shuttered restaurant and remembers the weight of Scarfo's stare. Somewhere in Atlantic City, a dealer remembers slipping an envelope into the wrong hand and hearing nothing. For 3 weeks, Scarfo may be gone, but the silence, that's still here, and it listens. In the long, low twilight of Nicodemo Scarfo's memory, what remains isn't marble or myth, but mood, an atmosphere, a chill that lingers, not because it's cold, but because it once was. Ask anyone who lived through his era, and they won't describe a man. They'll describe a climate. He wasn't the storm. He was the pressure drop before it hit. Scarfo's legacy doesn't fill museums. It doesn't decorate casino walls or glow in neon retrospectives. You won't find his name etched in gold on brass plaques. What you'll find are absences, spaces where people used to gather, doors that stayed locked even in daylight, habits passed down in families without ever being explained. You don't need to say Scarfo's name in certain places. The silence says it for you. That's how deep his shadow ran. Even after his death, even after his name faded from newspaper ink and cable specials, the ripple remained. Not loud, not visible, just constant, like static in the back of a phone call. like the feeling someone else is holding the last page of your story. In training academies across the country, his story is still used. Not just to teach about organized crime, but to teach about systems of fear, how to recognize them, how they're built, how they collapse. One instructor once told his class, Scarfo didn't run a family. He ran a philosophy, one where no one was safe, not even himself. And that's the truest thing you can say about him, because in the end, Scarfo became a prisoner of his own rules. The loyalty he demanded with such sharpness turned brittle. The systems he designed to prevent betrayal became factories for it. The silence he worshipped became isolation. He was the kind of man who could win every battle and still lose the war, because he never stopped fighting, even after the war was already his. Many people still think Scarfo wanted peace, but those who knew him best say that peace bored him. So what do you think? Can a man who builds his identity on conflict ever survive the stillness that comes after? There's an anecdote from a corrections officer who monitored Scarfo's final months. He said Scarfo never watched TV, rarely spoke, and only ever made one request. Put the fan on, he said. Low, but on. It wasn't about comfort. It was about sound. Scarfo needed that low hum, maybe because it drowned the quiet, or maybe because it mimicked the world he once ruled, a world that never quite settled, that always buzzed with tension. Now, years gone, his story ends not with fireworks or final confessions, but with something smaller, a soft click of a cell door, the low whir of an old fan, a name etched into a file no one opens anymore, because legacies don't have to be loud. Some, like Scarfo's, are made of still air, of moments people still hesitate to mention, of footsteps people still count, even when the hallway's empty. And as you drift off tonight, with the lights low and the room settling around you, maybe you'll understand. It's not the men who raise their voices that stay with us. It's the ones who didn't have to. So now, with the story told, let it all soften. Let the sharp edges blur, and the names, the long ones, the whispered ones, float back into the silence they came from. You've walked through decades tonight, through alleys that don't appear on maps, through conversations that ended before they began, through lives shaped by glances, gestures, and the weight of not knowing what came next. And now, it's safe to stop walking. Let the boardwalk fade behind you. Let the last street lamp flicker out in the distance. You don't need to watch the windows anymore. You don't need to sit with your back to the wall. There's nothing waiting in the shadows now. Not really. What remains is stillness, just a quiet room, just the hum of the fan, just the rhythm of your own breath, slowing, softening, sinking with the hush around you, because stories like this weren't meant to rile you up. They were meant to carry you down, to dim the noise, to hush the day. And tonight, we did just that. So close your eyes now. Let the memories that aren't yours drift gently past. No need to hold on. No need to look back. Let the ghost slip back into the hallway. Let the city quiet. Let the silence mean peace, not fear. You've heard enough for one night. Sweet dreams.